Hello and welcome back as we discuss Till We Have Faces Book 2, which is probably the most difficult section of reading this entire study that we can talk about. There's just so much going on here, and also I think that a very in-depth didactic analysis can only go but so far in helping us to enter into what Lewis is doing here. Remember that an important part of myth is that this isn't just a simple allegory. It's not just, Lewis is not, as he does in some of his other texts, really taking a set of ideas and then setting them to story. He's instead providing us with something more concrete. And the more concrete something is, the less words are able to do with it. And so really, I think that the most I can do here is provide you with a conversation partner, provide you with a guide through some of this, but even that's not the right language. I'm not going to provide you so much with a guide through what Lewis is doing, but rather I'm going to try to serve as a guide into what Lewis is doing, to move us into the dark places, to move us into the holy places, to help us go underground, so to speak, in a place where we can no longer see through the clear water of reason, but everything is dark like soil and blood. And so you might not walk out of this with a keen grasp of everything that's happening in a rational, abstract sense. I certainly don't. I've read and I've listened to Book 2 of Till We Have Faces many times now over the last couple years or so, and every time I feel like I get closer to understanding what Lewis is doing, but the closer I get to understanding what Lewis is doing, the further away I feel to what Lewis is doing. In other words, the more you go further up and further in, well, the more you recognize there is more to go further up and further in. And so I hope that's as clear as mud, or perhaps as blood. All right, let's get started. So at this point, Orwell has written her Complaint Against the Gods, which is Book 1. And even though she was obviously very embittered, obviously her perspective is not spot on, as we're going to see really specifically in Book 2, the writing process, simply going over her life, simply expressing her complaint, played a very important role because, well, now she has something to engage with. She has, as imperfect as it may be, she has something to look at. She has a kind of mirror, again, as imperfect, as dirty as it might be. She has a mirror to her soul that she can look at. And I think that this really points to the significance of articulating yourself, articulating your psyche, so to speak. Because a lot of times we're caught up in all kinds of anxieties about ourselves, about our position in the world, and really anxiety is a fear about nothing, or at least a fear of the unknown, fear of something that isn't clearly before your eyes. And that's what makes anxiety different than fear, right? You're afraid of a concrete reality. A bear walks into the room, or somebody holds up a gun. Okay, that might make you afraid. You're afraid of a concrete reality. Well, anxiety is more of a fear at potential, kind of what something might mean, at something that might happen. It's a fear of the potential, but a potential isn't actually, it's not actual, right? That's what it means to be potential. And so in many ways, it is a fear of nothing. And so a lot of times we don't even really know exactly what we're anxious about because it's such an ambivalent sensation. And so sometimes simply articulating our complaints, as imperfect, as skewed, as maybe even sinful as it may be, simply articulating what's really going on in our soul now gives us something to work with. Now we can determine whether or not that projection of our soul is something that we want to entertain or something that we want to correct and move in a different direction away from. And so this is why there is some precedent, even biblically speaking, right? There is precedent for simply being honest, being brutally and painfully honest, and then letting that sit where it will. Think of many of the Psalms in which David or the other psalmists are they're expressing some kind of great lament. God, where are you? Where are you? Why aren't you acting? And then they end off with, blessed be the name of the Lord, or something to that effect. In other words, in voicing their complaint, they find the answer, much as we're going to see with Orwell. And so, the change which the writing wrought in me, and of which I did not write, was only a beginning, only to prepare me for the God surgery, They use my own pen to probe my wound. And so in expressing her complaint, she is actually moving toward the answer to her complaint and recognizing that all along she's really been complaining about herself. Right? She's writing against Ungit, but we're going to kind of find she is Ungit. And so her whole complaint has been about herself. And she can get her perspective reworked here in book 2. And the role of writing continues to play out here when she starts to have these visions that parallel the trials of Psyche. And for Apulace's tale, you can go back and look at the intro video to Till We Have Faces, in which I lay out that tale, where Psyche has to go through all these different trials in order to appease Venus, right? So after she's driven away from her palace, she eventually goes to Venus, who treats her really as a prisoner and makes her do all of these outrageous things. And so one of the things she has to do is to separate out all these different seeds in this pile. It's obviously an impossible, or at least seemingly impossible task. But in the original tale, some ants show up and they help Psyche accomplish the task. And so she is aided by nature, by providence, something of that sort. Well, here, in reference to writing her book, we're told that Orual perceives this task of separating out all the different seeds, but she comes to find that she herself is the ant. So she initially kind of embodies Psyche here. She's doing the task. And we're told that it seemed impossible, but because it was a dream, there was this chance that it could conceivably be done. And I think that this dream aesthetic speaks to the reality of faith, that something that might not make sense from a naturalistic worldview, from even the worldview of the fox, according to his pure human reason, that it might be impossible according to natural human reason, but there is something that transcends reason here. There is the dream of faith that says that this task of accomplishing the demands of love actually is possible. But then she comes to find that she actually isn't Psyche here, right? She is an ant who is serving Psyche. And so she plays this role in helping Psyche be herself. And in helping Psyche be herself, she also is going to become Psyche. Psyche will be able to return the favor. Psyche will be able to give her gift to Orual, even as Orual gives her gift of suffering to Psyche. And so there's this intermingling of persons here, which is exactly what love does. It causes us to break out of our isolation, and we, to a significant degree at least, we become part of someone else, and someone else becomes part of us. And the fox is going to say something about that, about the intermingling of gods and men a little bit later on. But already we see this confusion of persons between Orual and Psyche, and that's because both of them are really serving the other, even though Orual doesn't understand that at this point. And even I only kind of sort of understand it, reading it from the outside. All right, let's keep going. Well, in chapter 1 of book 2, Terran shows up. And if you'll remember, Terran was back from near the beginning of the story. He had a thing with Redival. They were making out or whatever, and the king had him castrated. And, well, eventually things turned out okay for Terran, as he became an advisor of a great court, largely due to the fact that he was a eunuch. And so things ended up going pretty well for him, at least on a prestige level. Well, he comes back and he talks to Orual, and they talk about Redival. And Terran helps Orual understand that Redival deserves a degree of sympathy. I mean, she didn't have a mother, just like Orual, and she really didn't have a father. And so Orual is really all that Redival had. Well, when the fox showed up, Orual stopped paying so much attention to Redival and started paying more attention to the fox. And then when Psyche was born, she really took all of Orual's attention. And so Redival was left to the side. She was sidelined. And so she really had absolutely nobody. She was radically isolated, which explains a lot of her behavior, which Psyche assumed that Redival was just rotten. But now she comes to find that she had a part to play in that she was Ungit, that she was this consuming force, and that she really, in her disordered loves, ended up consuming Redival. And so this is the beginning of her getting some self-reflection, of seeing that she is not just the eternal victim that she's always seen herself as, but that she has some part to play in causing malice and in really just consuming everybody around her. And so she consumed Redival, and that's the beginning of her process of self-understanding. And then this continues in an even more pronounced form when she's talking to Ansit, the now widow of Bardia. And I think this is significant to take a look at. So Ansit says, I do not believe, I know, that your queenship drank up his blood, Bardia's blood, year by year, and ate out his life. Then why did you not tell me? A word from you would have sufficed. Or are you like the gods, who will speak only when it is too late? Tell you, she said, looking at me with a sort of proud wonder. Tell you, and so take away from him his work, which was his life. For what's any woman to a man and a soldier in the end? And all his glory and his great deeds. Make a child and a daughter of him? Keep him to myself at that cost? Make him so mine that he was no longer his? And yet he would have been yours. But I would be his. I was his wife, not his doxy. He was my husband, not my house dog. He was to live the life he thought best and fittest for a great man, not that which would most pleasure me. You have taken Elurdia now too. He will turn his back on his mother's house more and more. He will seek strange lands and be occupied with matters I don't understand, and go where I can't follow, and be daily less mine, more his own and the world's. Do you think I'd lift up my little finger if lifting it would stop it? And so just as Orual consumed Redival, she consumed Bardia as well. Even this language of she drank up his blood, just as Ungit does, right? That this is one of the things she often describes Ungit as doing, that Ungit just drinks up the blood as this consuming sort of vampire monster is really kind of how she sees Ungit. And now she did this to Redival, she did this to Bardia. And Ansett here provides Orual with an example of a kind of love that Orual has never actually known herself, or at least she's never exhibited, she's never manifested in her own life, in her own relationships. Ansett says that she wouldn't do anything to rip Bardia away from that which brought him glory, that which filled his life with meaning and purpose, that which made Bardia Bardia. And so she didn't want him to be hers in the sense of like consuming him and making him her lapdog. No, she wanted Bardia to be Bardia, just as she wants her son to be her son. And this speaks to what Lewis talks about in The Four Loves, in that the right kind of love helps people to be more themselves. The right kind of motherly love, the right kind of parental love equips children to stand on their own 2 feet. It is a demented, it is a demonic, it is a perverted, it is a corrupted love that seeks to consume others and bring them almost enslaved into your orbit. And so Ansett, this woman that Orual has only ever had negative thoughts and negative feelings about, here stands as this model of what love actually is. Love for husband, love for son. And it provides a pretty strong rebuke to Orual that, on the surface level, she isn't really able to receive, but it's just starting to add to this collection of self-understanding that eventually is going to burst out in the relatively near future at this point. And now she goes to the Temple of Ungit, and I looked at Ungit herself. She had not, like most sacred stones, fallen from the sky. Story was, at the very beginning, she had pushed her way up out of the earth, a foretaste of, or an ambassador from, whatever things may live and work down there, one below the other all the way down under the dark weight and heat. I have said she had no face, but that meant she had 1,000 faces. It was a little like Bata as I remembered her in certain of her moods. Bata, when we were very small, had loving moods, even to me. Okay, so Ungit is pushed up from the earth, and I talked about this last time, how the Temple of Ungit is said to be the egg out of which the world was born, and now we're told that this rock of Ungit pushed herself up from the ground, and so this speaks to the feminine nature of the ground, and even Arnhem, the priest, is going to describe this, that as water falls down onto the earth receives the water and then gives rise to new life, to vegetation and whatnot. And this gets to the quintessential, or the ideal manifestations of the masculine and the feminine, as we've seen throughout Ransom. The masculine is that which lays itself down into the feminine receives the masculine and gives rise to new life. This is the relationship between Malacandra and Paralandra, and we've already talked about how that plays out in the Ransom series quite a bit, but the same thing is happening here. Ungit is associated with the earth itself is feminine. The feminine receives the masculine, receives the rain that comes down, and I'm not going to get unnecessarily explicit with pulling out that imagery there, but likely you can fill in the gaps. And so Ungit stands for the feminine. And now the misappropriated feminine does simply consume. It doesn't receive and produce life, it simply consumes and takes. This is the devouring mother rather than the truly loving and enabling mother. And so there are many different faces here that the feminine can take, some positive, some negative. Well, in this moment of increasing self-understanding, Orwell sees the face of Bada, who, I don't know, I kind of get the impression she was never really this ideal caretaker, but nonetheless, she did have some good qualities that were likely twisted and likely misunderstood by Orwell in her bitterness. But there is this connection here between Bada and the feminine. I mean, Bada was probably the closest thing to a mother that Orwell actually had. And so it makes sense that she would connect Bada with the feminine. But keep in mind that as soon as she was able to do so, Orwell had Bada killed. And that's because she was really trying to destroy this feminine. Her whole life as, the warrior queen was a flee from the feminine. And so she even killed Bada, who stands for the feminine in her mind. But as she's moving closer to a recovery of her true self, as she's moving closer to gaining a face, so to speak, she starts to think of Bada in more of a positive light. I'm not going to read all this because I just mentioned it, but Orwell asks Arnhem, who is Ungit? And he gives this naturalistic kind of explanation in that, well, Ungit is the earth, the womb and mother of all living things. And so she receives the rains and then produces new life. And Orwell hears this and basically thinks he's just describing the water cycle and says, okay, why do we clothe something so mundane in this mythological language? And Arnhem says, well, it's to hide it from the simple. And I feel like we get the sense that Arnhem himself is not very religious in the right kind of way. He's a little bit too influenced by the fox, in that he kind of explains away a lot of the religious language, but he's also saying something true about the value of myth, that myth helps us to maintain the mystery that is implicit in what we would sometimes treat as mundane. In fact, there's a great throwaway line in Lewis's essay, Myth Became Fact, in which he says, is not the sky itself a myth? And he just kind of goes on from there and doesn't stop to explain it. But I think that he's saying something significant there, in that myth is not just a story that we tell. Myth is the reality that we live. It is the narratives that we embody. And so to Arnhem's point, sometimes describing even natural processes in mythological language can help us to recognize the more metaphysical significance of what's happening in apparently natural process. And so I don't think Arnhem has the full account here, but I still think he provides us something significant about the value of myth. And of course, he also points to this relationship between the feminine and the masculine that we've already been discussing. Now next, while still at the temple, he comes across this woman who is praying to Ungit, to the old Ungit, right? Not the Greek version, but the old faceless or faceful stone. And she says, do you always pray to that Ungit? Said I, nodding toward the shapeless stone, and not to that. Here I nodded toward our new image, standing tall and straight in her robes. Whatever the fox might say of it, the loveliest thing our land has ever seen. Oh, always this queen, said she. That other, the Greek Ungit, she wouldn't understand my speech. She's only for nobles and learned men. There's no comfort in her. And so those who aren't just taken over to learned abstraction, right? Those who aren't just the trained philosophers, those trying to fit in with Hellenistic society, but real people, more authentic people, people that don't live in abstraction, but people who live in concrete realities, they go to the old stone, the shapeless stone, because she is too real. She is too concrete. She is too particular to be moved into Hellenized abstractions about clearly articulated visions of beauty. And so there's something more real here, and that which doesn't fit nicely into our categories of understanding. And I think that there's something very significant about that there's something more real in the old Ungit than in the new Ungit. And at this point, she starts to have just a series of visions. She's moving in and out of dreams and reality, and it's not even really clear what the difference is. In fact, there's a great line, I don't think I put it in here, but she says that it seems to her that the difference between a dream and a reality is that a dream is only known to a particular person. And that doesn't necessarily make it any less real for it. And so it comes down to the scale of access, not necessarily the difference between a fact and a falsehood. But anyways, so she has this dream and she encounters her father in the pillar room, and her father tells her to dig. And so they dig down and they go down a few different levels, and we get one of my favorite lines in the book. "There's no fox to help you here," said my father. "We're far below any dens that foxes can dig. There's hundreds of tons of earth between you and the deepest of them. And so, there's no fox to help you here. We are far below any dens that foxes can dig." And this gets to what Lewis has been giving us throughout this entire story, as well as many of his other works, that reason is valuable in as far as it goes, but it only goes so far. Reason itself, if reason is good, then that means it needs to be contextualized into that which makes good things good. And so what that means is that if we're going to actually embrace the good, we need to transcend reason. We need to go to the mountain from which all beauty comes. And, as Psyche says, I want to go to the mountain from which all beauty comes. And she has this desire for something that can't be clearly and rationally articulated. Well, this is where Lewis is bringing us. We're bringing us past the point of reason. And as I've talked about before, we see this in a lot of the old thinkers. We see this in even some of the Greek thinkers, right? Like Plato, for example, when he portrays the good as the sun, which is not something that you are to look directly at, is that which you look by. And so there is a kind of mysticism in Plato, but it only goes so far because he's operating based off kind of some Fox-like reason. It's very much a natural kind of reason, even though I would say that Plato is still fundamentally a religious kind of philosopher. But when we move things into the Christian context of the Middle Ages, well, at this point, a lot of the medieval thinkers, even those who are very rational and systematic in their thought, very often they'll get to a point where they fall into a kind of mysticism, in which they're dealing with realities that they can't neatly categorize. Probably the best example would be Thomas Aquinas, who I know I have mentioned in a previous video, but he had a very systematic form of thinking. He created just some genius, robust tomes of theology, but then he gets toward the end of his life and he has some kind of experience with God, and he looks at everything he produced and says that it's all straw. Not necessarily saying it's all false, but it's nothing compared to that at which it was directed. Because the closer we get to reality, the more concrete things become. And the more concrete something is, the less it's given over to abstraction. And language is always abstraction. And so she's going somewhere that the fox himself could never go. And she says that she wasn't even so much dragged, but she was sucked along. She was being pulled into this other reality. And she's left to stand in front of this version of the mirror in the pillar room, and she is asked by the king, "Who is Ungit?" And she isn't even convincing. She knows the answer. She says, "I am Ungit." And then she wakes up or walks out of the vision. And so now she understands. She is Ungit. She is what she's been complaining against for really her entire life up to this point, or at least most of her life. That she's always seen Ungit as just this consuming force. It takes the bones and gives nothing back. It consumes women, it consumes men, it just consumes prophets, it consumes souls, and never gives anything back. It is the all-consuming mother. Well, that is exactly who Orual is. In fact, we're going to see that's who we all are by nature. We are all Ungit. We are all born into this corrupted version of the feminine. Remember, as Ransom says, there is something above us that is so masculine that we are all feminine in relation to it. And so we are all Ungit. We all tend to just consume those around us, even if we might think that we have good intentions, such as she had for Bardia, right? Or even as she had for Psyche. She thought she had good intentions for them, but all she's doing is consuming, and giving nothing back. She is the god against which she has cast her complaint. And so, despairing of this situation, she decides to go and kill herself. And she goes to the river and plans to throw herself in. But the god stops her. "Do not do it," said the god. "You cannot escape Ungit by going to the Deadlands, for she is there also. Die before you die. There is no chance after." And so she can't die, she can't go into the earth, because remember, that's the domain of Ungit. Ungit herself is an ambassador of the earth. In another sense, Ungit is the earth. She is that which receives. The grave itself is Ungit, as that which receives, that which passes into it. And so there is a kind of masculine-feminine relationship there, even in death. And so there is no escaping from Ungit by simply going into the Deadlands. What she needs to do is not enter into death, but she needs to embrace death in the right way so that she can actually live, even if she dies. In other words, she needs to die to self. She needs to look outward. She needs to stop being the consuming Ungit and learn to be the life-giving Ungit. And remember, that is an important point of who Ungit is. Ungit is that which gave birth to the world as we know it. And we've already seen in the crowds of Gloam, they see Ungit as this beautiful, as this fundamentally good goddess. They see the positive elements of the feminine that Orual has never been able to see. And the way that you go from being the consuming Ungit to being Ungit in her right cosmic order is by dying to self. You stop consuming, you stop trying to make people your own, and you do your part in giving yourself over and giving your beauty away so that you can make people more themselves. You can make your spouse more themselves, make your children, your friends, those around you, make people more themselves. That's how you embrace this feminine ideal, whether you are male or feminine, because remember, we all have this feminine tendency or this feminine identity in relation to God. And so even though we might have, and we do have, a different masculine-feminine relationship with other people, kind of in society, in our marriages, and that sort of thing, we do all still have this feminine role to play in helping to give birth to people, so to speak, in helping people to be more themselves. That's how you embody true love. But first you have to die to your own self-serving, self-referential tendencies and your own tendencies to consume other people. You need to be able to give yourself away. But it's going to take her a little while to figure that out. And so she thinks that being called Ungit means that she was ugly in soul, because she doesn't yet really understand what Ungit is. She thinks Ungit is what she's always thought it is, and that now that's what she is. And so she is identifying herself with Ungit in all of her corruption and all of her ugliness, in her being greedy and blood-gorged. But she thinks that if she walks the path of the fox, if she uses reason and pursues virtue, then she can develop a good, a beautiful soul. And so that's what she was going to set out to do. And so for a time, she just works on self-improvement, and she seems to have some success, but even later in the day, she'll start to go back into old habits. And so she comes to find that the gods aren't helping her. And then she falls into a victim mentality again, thinking, well, maybe the gods won't help me because I have an ugly soul. And so she's still falling into this victim mentality in which she just thinks everyone's out to get her. And so she sees a need for change, but she's increasingly recognizing this is not a change that she is going to be able to gain on her own. She's not going to be able to pull herself up by her bootstraps. She needs something else. Well, she needs transforming grace. Well, now she has another vision. She's walking over burning sands carrying an empty bowl, and she has to get water from the river that flows into the Deadlands and fill it with the water of death and bring it back without spilling a drop and to give it to Ungit. And so she has to get water from the Deadlands for Ungit. And so in this vision, she's not Ungit, she is Ungit's slave or prisoner. And so we're again seeing some conflation between the person of Orual and the person of Psyche. Psyche herself, who was imprisoned and enslaved by Venus until she accomplished her task. And so there's still this confusion of persons here. And she comes across this mountain that she can't transcend, and this eagle comes to her and says, "Woman, who are you?" "Orual, Queen of Gloam," said I. "Then it is not you that I was sent to help. What is that roll you carry in your hands?" I now saw with great dismay that I had been carrying all this time was not a bowl, but a book, and this ruined everything. "It is my complaint against the gods," said I. The eagle clapped his wings and lifted his head and cried out with a loud voice, "She's come at last. Here is the woman who has a complaint against the gods." So first she introduces herself as Orual, Queen of Gloam, and the eagle says, "That's not who I'm looking for." And remember, the Queen of Gloam is this persona that Orual adopted in order to kill off Orual. Remember, she described that as a kind of reverse pregnancy in which the Queen of Gloam continued to get bigger and bigger, and Orual continued to get smaller and smaller inside of her. And so Queen of Gloam is but a veil that she was trying to wear in order to cover up her true self. It was a way of living without a face. And so it's not until she shows some honesty and says, "I'm here to issue my complaint against the gods," the eagle says, This is who I'm looking for. I'm not looking for Orwell, Queen of Gloam. I'm looking for the person who has a complaint against the gods. It's looking for honesty. It's looking for a true confession. And so Orwell is brought before the court of the gods, where she is to give her complaint. And basically her whole complaint is that Psyche was hers all along, and the gods had no right to take her away. Psyche was mine, Psyche was mine, Psyche was mine. And so she's really just, in many different ways, just spouting out this idea that she had all rights to Psyche. No one had any right to take her away. And, the gods might say that, well, they're bringing Psyche into a realm of bliss that Orwell never could have given her. And Orwell says that they had no right to do that because she was hers. And so it's just this consuming mother mentality, this kind of twisted demonic love that she had for Psyche. That is really the source of her complaint. But then she stopped talking. There was utter silence all around me. And now for the first time I knew what I had been doing. While I was reading, it had, once and again, seemed strange to me that the reading took so long, for the book was a small one. Now I knew that I had been reading it over and over, perhaps a dozen times. I would have read it forever, quick as I could, starting the first word again almost before the last was out of my mouth, if the judge had not stopped me. And the voice I read it in was strange to my ears. There was given to me a certainty that this, at last, was my real voice. There was silence in the dark assembly, long enough for me to have read my book out yet again. At last the judge spoke. "Are you answered?" he said. "Yes," said I. And I think that there's something very important happening here. And so her complaint, as reasonable as it seemed, right? She seemed entirely, right? She all along, she thought that she was entirely justified in her complaint against the gods. But now we see that she is just going through this petty repetition of words, that really don't have any substance to them. It reminds me of the unman in Paralandra. Ransom, 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 ransom. And then Ransom would say, "What is it?" "Oh, nothing." And so it is really just this vain repetition of words that has no substance behind it. And when this shadow reality is brought to her vision, she can't help but to recognize it as just that, as empty. And so the complaint was the answer. To have heard myself making it was to be answered. Lightly men talk of saying what they mean. Often, when he was teaching me to write in Greek, the fox would say, "Child, to say the very thing you really mean, the whole of it, nothing more or less or other than what you really mean, that's the whole art and joy of words." A glib saying. When the time comes to you at which you will be forced at last to utter the speech which has been lain at the center of your soul for years, which you have, all the time, idiot-like, been saying over and over, you'll not talk about joy of words. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer, till that word can be dug out of us. Why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? How can they meet us face to face, till we have faces? By the way, that word idiot-like, that's not just insulting. It actually means something. And coming from the Greek idios, it means to have something for your own. It's like a private understanding, an understanding that only you have that nobody else has. And so it speaks to this mentality of isolation that we've seen in Ransom, that we're going to see again in The Great Divorce. This idea that the more that you make yourself the context for reality, well, the more that you are in a state of despair, whether that seem happy or whether that seem sad or whether that seem angry or embittered or justified or whatever, that when you are the context for reality, well, that reality is very, very small. This is why in The Great Divorce, hell is infinitesimally small compared to the expansiveness of heaven. Because the more that you close yourself off in your own mind, well, the less you're able to give yourself away in love, the less you're able to receive love, the less you're able to receive the love of God and express that kind of gift love to other people. You're simply trying to consume. The Unga that Orwell has known up to this point is an idiot in this technical sense of being alone and simply seeing everything as prey, even with positive intentions and justifications and rationalizations. In practice, it treats everything as prey and just wants to consume. We saw this in Screwtape, where in the lowerarchy of hell, each demon really just wants to consume the one below it, or above it, I guess, kind of going to the less significant. And so they just want to consume everything else. We saw this in That Hideous Strength, as Wither really just consumed the whole environment of Belbury. And now we see this in Orwell, that she, as a miniature hell on earth, simply sought to consume the world into her own context. And is this not exactly what we are taught to do in our culture today? We are taught to speak our truth, live our truth. Don't let anybody judge you. You just be you. Be your authentic self with no relation to the good, with no relation to reason, with no relation to, certainly not to God, right? You want nothing to judge you. You just be you. And so we are all taught to be Orwell. We are taught to be the consuming Ungit. And if we're going to gain anything like life, if we're actually going to engage with love of God and love for other people and even love for ourselves, well, we have to do what it takes for Ungit to be redeemed. And for Orwell, that means, okay, she needs to be honest. And once she was honest and was able to articulate what was happening within her soul, well, then she was able to recognize that there was nothing happening within her soul, which is not a bad place to be if you want to be filled. Now, I love this interaction she has with the fox. And the fox asked for Orwell's forgiveness for misleading her, for only giving her words, for only giving her the clear water of reason, but not that which she most fundamentally needed. And then I love Orwell's response here. I to forgive you, grandfather? No, I must speak. I knew at that time that all those good reasons you gave for staying in Gloam after you were a free man were only disguises for your love. I knew you stayed only in pity and love for me. I knew you were breaking your heart for the Greek lands. I ought to have sent you away. I lapped up all you gave me like a thirsty animal. Oh, grandfather, and it's right. I've battened on the lives of men. It's true, isn't it? And so the fox apologizes for his lack of wisdom. And Orwell says, no, it wasn't words that you gave me. It was your love. And so the fox is the closest thing to a father that she had, right? This is her grandfather. And so we see some redemption of the fox, that, yeah, he wasn't perfect. And yes, through his natural reason, he really led her astray. But nonetheless, his love for her provides a kind of redeeming role for the fox, because it was more than reason that he gave. It was his love. And I just think there's something so special about that. It's one of those things that kind of brings tears to my eyes. All right, so Orwell has given her accusation to the gods, and now it is the gods' turn. And she says, I cannot hope for mercy. The fox says, infinite hopes and fears may both be yours. Be sure that whatever else you get, you will not get justice. Are the gods not just? Oh no, child. What would become of us if they were? But come and see. And so, at this point, she recognizes the fact that it would be just for her to be condemned. She has fallen into just utter despair of herself, which is exactly where you need to be if you're going to receive grace. To recognize that everything that you need lies outside of you and must be given to you as a gift. And so she recognizes that in a just trial, she would stand condemned before the gods. But the fox brings up this idea that if the gods were just, essentially we would all stand accused. We would all stand condemned, rather. And so she has hope that the gods are not just. Now, obviously, importing this into a Christian theological context, Lewis is not saying that God isn't just, right? That yes, grace is available, mercy is available, and that doesn't cancel out justice. But Lewis here, he's not doing systematic theology. He's providing us with a myth. And so in saying that the gods aren't just, he's really just emphasizing the fact that we don't get what we deserve. In The Great Divorce, there's this guy who says, I'm not asking for any bleeding charity. I just want my rights. And the response that he gets is, ask for the bleeding charity. Typically when we tell God, or when we even just implicitly tell God that we want what we deserve, well, we don't really recognize what it is that we're asking for. And so that's the thing that viewing this within the context of a story, within the context of a myth, I think this is actually done really well. When he says, be sure that whatever else you get, you will not get justice. For if the gods were just, what would become of us? But come and see. And now she sees a series of visions about Psyche. And so first she sees Psyche go to the river and she prepares to cast herself in, to kill herself. And Orwell, obviously as Orwell did. And Orwell calls out for her not to do it. And then she turns around and leaves. And, I almost wonder, how far do we go with this intermingling of Orwell and Psyche? How much is metaphorical? How much is almost literal? When Orwell heard the god tell her not to kill her, well, was that something like what Orwell was doing right then and looking at the vision? In other words, is there some kind of intermingling, some kind of conflation between the god of the mountain, Orwell, and Psyche, kind of all just mixed together? And that's kind of where I tend to go with this. And I think that line the fox is going to give in just a little bit will point us in that direction as well. But let's keep going. So next you see Psyche sorting all of these seeds, and seems to be this impossible task, but she's going about it, and she's accomplishing it with the help of the ants, right? With the help of Orwell, who recognized herself as an ant in her own vision. And next we see the golden fleece. And so Ungit, or Psyche as Ungit, they need to get something external to themselves in order to make themselves beautiful. And so that's the pursuit of the golden fleece. And then there's this vision in the desert with the bowl and the scroll. And so in the next picture, I saw both Psyche and myself, but I was only a shadow. We toiled together over those burning sands, and she with her empty bowl, I with the book full of my poison. So remember, before, Orwell was the one with the bowl who had to get water from the river of death, but now Psyche has the bowl, and Orwell is there as her shadow with the complaint. And I don't think that Lewis is himself a Jungian. In fact, he says that fairly directly. At the same time, I can't help but to see some connection to Jung here, especially with this shadow imagery. And so Orwell and Psyche really need to be integrated together in order to become themselves. And that Orwell, as the negative version of Psyche, can be brought into a positive, but the way that happens is is by having the shadow integrated into the substance, just as a particular has to rise up into the form in order to be more itself. So too, Orwell is something like a shadow, an imperfect, particular manifestation of the ideal represented in Psyche. And so Orwell needs to sort of go up into Psyche in order to gain substance and stop being a shade, stop being a shadow. She needs to become a substantial person. And that's some imagery we're going to return to again next week when we get to the Great Divorce. This idea of a shade becoming substantial. I think that that's some imagery that we're getting right here. And then she turns to the fox, her guide, and says, how could she, did she really do such things and go to such places and not... Grandfather, she was all but unscathed. She was almost happy. Another bore nearly all the anguish. Is it possible? That was one of the true things I used to say to you. Don't you remember? We're all limbs and part of one whole, hence of each other. Men and gods flow in and out and mingle. And that right there is actually very similar to something Marcus Aurelius says in his Meditations. But what this glorified of sorts fox is telling us is that there is some truth in this. That there is this connection of persons and ideas that takes place within this sort of shared spiritual space that we have. This nous, for those of you who know your Hellenistic philosophy, that we operate within this common realm of spirit, this common realm of reason, of mind. And so the more that we are dying to self, the less that we're being self-referential, the more we're recognizing the interrelations we have with each other. And so Orwell learns that in the anguish of her life, she was doing something significant in service to Psyche, even though she knew it not. Remember, Orwell, in writing and even living out her story, Orwell is the ant that is serving Psyche, her own pursuit of reuniting with her love. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly how to parse all this out, but what we see is, I think that Orwell and Psyche really both need each other in order to properly be themselves. That Psyche, to be Psyche, the instantiation of love, the instantiation of beauty, she needs to give herself over to Orwell and bring about new life. Remember, early in the story, after Psyche is born, in kind of a perverted, distorted version of love, Orwell says that she wishes that she were a man so she could be Psyche's lover. Well, in a certain mythological, a certain metaphysical sense, what we actually see here is that Psyche kind of plays a masculine role to Orwell, and in loving and positing herself toward Orwell, Orwell ends up giving birth to her true self. Ungit's husband rains down on her, Ungit receives the rain and then bears fruit. And so Psyche, despite manifesting the feminine ideal herself, in relation to Orwell, she actually played a masculine role. Orwell was the feminine, which was eventually able to receive Psyche and then give rise to new life, to become herself. As the fox says, all, even Psyche, are born into the house of Ungit, and all must get free from her. Or say that Ungit in each must bear Ungit's son and die in childbed, or change. And now Psyche must go down into the Deadlands to get beauty in a casket from the Queen of the Deadlands, from Death herself, and bring it back to give it to Ungit, so that Ungit will become beautiful. And so Ungit in each must bear Ungit's son and die in childbed. And so motherhood is a kind of dying to self and giving rise to new life. And so Orual herself, she needed to be killed and raised from the dead. She needed to fulfill her role in bearing a child, even if it cost her her life, or at least the life of the identity that she had been crafting. And I think that's the point here, that Psyche poured into Orual, and Orual, with Psyche's love, was able to give rise to new life, and the Orual, as she knew herself, had to die in this process. And that's the best I can do at the moment to making sense out of this. And I think there's something really significant there, even though I think it's going to be a lifetime of trying to articulate it, because we're dealing with something that can't be entirely articulated. We're dealing with what I believe to be a true myth. And then we get just this heartbreaking realization in which she says, "Did we really do these things to her?" I asked. "Yes, all here is true. And we said we loved her. And we did. She had no more dangerous enemies than us. And in that far distant day when the gods become wholly beautiful, or we at last are shown how beautiful they always were, this will happen more and more. For mortals, as you said, will become more and more jealous, and mother and wife and child and friend will all be in league to keep a soul from being united with the divine nature." And I think surely Lewis, through the fox here, is pointing us toward the revelation of the gospel, in which everything good in the old pagan systems kind of gets redeemed, or rather brought to its fulfillment, brought to its clear picture in Christ. And as we move more and more into clarity, as Dimble would say, as things become more precise, things become more pointed, is that this tendency of disordered love keeping people from being themselves, from gaining the right kind of faith, is only going to become more and more prevalent. And I think of the words of Christ. "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth, for I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household." Few things can be more damaging. I don't know if anything can be more damaging than disordered love. That which comes as an angel of light, but is ultimately an ambassador for darkness. The corrupted parental love, the corrupted marital love, that things that seem to be well-intended, but really are set on consuming, on bringing in rather than giving out. Too often, we are Orual rather than Ansit to Bardia. We simply want to possess, we want to take hold of those around us, because we know what's best, right? Or as Orual says of Psyche in her complaint, "She was mine, she was mine, she was mine, and no one has any rights to take them away." That kind of consuming love sets us at variance with those that we claim to love. As Lewis says in the Four Loves, a distorted love can actually be a thin veil to cover up what is genuinely hatred. And if we don't want what is truly good for somebody, then we do, in fact, hate them, no matter how much we might try to justify our complaints against the gods. And will the gods one day grow thus beautiful, grandfather? They say, but even I, who am dead, do not yet understand more than a few broken words of their language. Only this I know. This age of ours will one day be the distant past, and the divine nature can change the past. Nothing is yet in its true form. And I think that is such a significant statement, that we don't yet know how things are settled in heaven, because we don't live in heaven, right? We live in an earth that is given over to change. And so we never really know what things mean in an eternal sense, or at least we don't fully know what things mean in an eternal sense until we get there. And so I think he's telling us something important about the relationship between our temporal life and the eternal stability of heaven. But I also think he's giving us something of his philosophy, or even his theology regarding pre-Christian paganism, that whatever was good in paganism is redeemed. It participates in Christ's harrowing of hell, that not only are the pre-Christian saints brought into the fullness of redemption, but also any genuine grasping at truth is eventually brought to attain it. And that's why Lewis can simultaneously give us a story in a pagan past that also is brought into relation with its fulfillment, its true fulfillment in Christian revelation. And we see this idea play out pretty clearly in the last battle. Regardless of the degree of ignorance, any genuine movement in the direction of the good is in fact good. The form works its way back into the particular, even as the eternal works its way back into the temporal. And now she finally engages with Psyche and refers to her as a goddess and starts to do reverence to her. She has surrendered her alleged claim onto Psyche. And Psyche lifts her up, basically says, "Don't worship me, I still have a task yet to do. I have not given you the casket. You know I went on a long journey to fetch the beauty that will make Ungit beautiful." And so Psyche has descended into the Deadlands. She has willingly embraced death so that Ungit can be made beautiful, so that Venus can be baptized, that Venus can be redeemed, and that she can actually be that which is loving. She can instantiate the feminine ideal, that which she was always meant to be. And I think that even stepping outside of the historical narrative, but stepping into more of the realm of myth, it's important to note that Psyche and Orual are one person. And it's when the soul willingly dies to self that it is able to instantiate the feminine ideals, is able to become beautiful. Remember, the beautiful is that which directs or that which serves as a conduit of truth and goodness. It brings harmony and order to the world around it. It helps things to be more themselves. It helps people to be more themselves. It helps the particulars rise up into form. Remember in the previous video when I included that scene from Sleeping Beauty, the Once Upon a Dream scene, in which Princess Aurora is going around instantiating beauty, she's singing her song, she's dancing around, and the woodland creatures are all kind of gathering around her, and that's because she's participating in this great dance that summons reality around it to participate in this great dance. And this is what Orual's Psyche become. So Orual is that part of the self that has to be given over to despair. It's that part of the self that has to recognize its helplessness and radical need for grace. Psyche, the soul, is what willingly moves into and even beyond this despair, into death, and in learning how to die, they are then prepared for death. And remember that line from Plato's Phaedo that Orual referenced earlier, that philosophy really is the practice of learning how to die. Well, I think that Lewis is taking that Platonic idea and making it even more significant in light of the Christian spiritual context that he's working with. And so you need simultaneously to have despair of self, that's Orual, but you also need the willing movement to embrace the death of self, that is Psyche, and brought together, you are able to receive grace. Psyche, that is the soul, is able to be reunited with her lover, love, right? Cupid, Eros, love. And so it's in despairing of self, it's in dying to self that you are equipped to engage with divine love. And once you are able to receive this gift love of God, now all of your other love, your parental love, your friendship love, your romantic love, all of these things are able to move into proper order, organized by the highest principle of love, which is the gift love of God. And ultimately, that is how Ungit is made to be beautiful. That's how we are all made to be beautiful. In her book on Till We Have Faces, Bareface, Doris Meyer says, Orual need not describe the reconciliation with Psyche. She says only that she wept a kind of tears that do not flow in this country. Instead of holding on to her superiority as Maya, Orual now sees that Psyche is far above her. Instead of being jealous of Psyche's beauty and strength, she rejoices in them. Far from wishing to control and possess Psyche, she delights in giving up her own agenda. Thus she is able to receive the beauty that comes from the Deadlands, from dying to self. And so, Orual is able to die to self, and in dying to self, she is no longer seeking to possess Psyche, but she is able to participate in the great dance that Psyche is manifesting around her. She's able to see the good in Psyche. And then what's most important is that she doesn't just revel in the goodness of Psyche, but in seeing the goodness of Psyche, she's able to move up the chain of being in the direction of goodness itself. She is no longer focused on Psyche, but she is looking past Psyche. And in looking past Psyche, she actually loves Psyche more, because now they're both able to participate in this expansive reality of love, goodness, truth, and beauty. And then something starts to approach. As she gets this new perspective, she's able to look past Psyche. And now she experiences an approach of that which is above Psyche. Each breath I drew let me into new terror, joy, overpowering sweetness. I was pierced through and through with the arrows of it. I was being unmade, which, by the way, that language being pierced through and through with the arrows of it, that surely speaks to Cupid, the god of love, who is obviously being wrapped up in the god. I was being unmade. I was no one. But that's little to say. Rather, Psyche herself was, in a manner, no one. I loved her as I would once have thought it impossible to love, would have died any death for her. And yet it was not now, she that really counted. Or if she counted, and oh, gloriously she did, it was for another's sake. The earth and stars and sun, all that was or will be, existed for his sake. And he was coming. The most dreadful, the most beautiful, the only dread and beauty there is, was coming. And so now that she's looking past Psyche, she actually loves Psyche as she never has before. She recognizes that Psyche's beauty was a testimony to a higher reality. It reminds me of Jane Studdick on that train, when she first really sees herself as beautiful and she glories in that beauty was not her own, but it was for another. I think of the end of Paralandra, in which Malacandra and Paralandra say, "Love me, for I am superfluous." It's when we come to recognize the true center of reality, when we come to recognize that we are all participants in this great dance moving around the true center, which is the glory of God. Well, that's when we are free to love each other, not because we need each other, but we are able to simply give ourselves over in delight and in volitional affection and devotion to each other's good. Because we now have a middle term between us, the medium of God himself, that which is the true ideal of goodness and beauty, and the chief cause of dread, that which makes us small so that we can rise up in the greatness of splendor. This is where we find terror, this is where we find joy, this is where we find sweetness, this is where we are unmade of ourselves. This is where Ungit is unmade, that she might be made beautiful. And then two figures, reflections, their feet to Psyche's feet and mine, stood ahead downward in the water. But whose were they? Two Psyches, the one clothed, the other naked. Yes, both Psyches, both beautiful, if that mattered now, beyond all imagining, yet not exactly the same. "You also are Psyche," came a great voice. I looked up, and it's strange that I dared, but I saw no god, no pillared court. I was in the palace gardens, my foolish book in my hand. The vision to the eye had, I think, faded one moment before the oracle to the ear, for the words were still sounding. I ended my first book with the words, "No answer." I know now, Lord, why you utter no answer. You are yourself the answer. Before your face, questions die away. What other answers would suffice? Only words, words, to be led out to battle against other words. Long did I hate you. Long did I fear you. I might... That, of course, is when she dies. And, there's more that I wanted to say about this, and maybe in the context of leading a study, there's more I should say, but I kind of feel like that wouldn't be appropriate as I record this right now. I don't want to just leave you with words. I think that this is the perfect ending. The only thing I'll leave you with now are some words from Psyche. "We have made little use of the fox's teaching, if we're to be scared by death. And sister, he has sometimes let out that there were other Greek masters than those he follows himself, masters who have taught that death opens a door out of a little dark room, that's all the life we have known before it, into a great real place where the true sun shines and we shall meet. Until next time, Godspeed."